Hello, everyone. This is Enamul Haque from Bangladesh, and I'm with my friend Philip Shah from Canada. And this month, we are going to discuss something that we had discussed previously. In the last episode, we talked about de dollarization. And with that, the new world order is either being made or at least is in the process. And there is also a lot of new conflicts, and probably there is a new normal in the global world which previously existed probably during the Cold War. What I mean that at the moment there is a influence game being played by the Chinese, which is becoming one of the largest economy. The Americans, U.S. in particular, which is also looking at the Western values and Western economic gains out of it. And obviously Russia, which is part of the BRICS group, which means Russia, China, and India, Brazil, South Africa, are working toward creating an alternative multipolar world. So, given this, countries like Bangladesh and probably Canada also are going to be in a difficult position. Probably both countries are in pressure in the sense that they have to take sides, and this is a difficult economic and political global political scenario than what we have seen in the last 20 years, probably after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, given this, let me invite my friend Philip Shah to explain his opinion and express what is going on in Canada and probably with respect to Bangladesh, what he sees from his point of view.
Hello, well, my name is Philip Shaw, and I'm glad to be back with you with Dr. Haque for this month's edition of East West here from Ontario, Canada. It is incredibly interesting when you take it from my perspective, just living 17 kilometers from the American border. We have been influenced by our American friends for centuries, or not centuries, decades here in Canada. And typically Canadian society and the Canadian political economy is always affected by what the Americans are doing, and that probably will continue to be the way it is. But clearly things have changed over the time that Dr. Haque and I have known each other. I remember I think a phone call or something, a fax message to Dr. Haque many years ago talking about the Berlin Wall had fallen and different things that have changed the world. And now we've arrived at 2023 and we're seeing all these new influences. At least it's new to us in the West. I know in the East it maybe seems to be a little bit more of a natural progression, but I'll give you an example. Typically I have often thought of things from a Western perspective. That's an American perspective or a Western European perspective. But I've been to Bangladesh 7 or 8 times, and what I really found interesting when I went to Bangladesh, just the geography of the country. It's surrounded by India with a small footprint with Myanmar, but there's also a tremendous influence from China in Bangladesh as well. And from a Canadian perspective, you would never see that in this part of the world. But when you go there, you couldn't help but notice the number of Chinese people you would see and the different vehicles with Chinese workers there. And obviously there's a tremendous influence. And when you're surrounded by India, who is a superpower in the region, and of course China is as well to the east of there's obviously a big influence on the leaders of Bangladesh to persuade that country to see things either the Chinese or Indian way. But of course, we live in a world where it's dominated by American interests to a large extent. And so it's always interesting to see from here how that could be so different in a place like Bangladesh. But as time has gone on, of course, we have some of the big flashpoints in history. And of course, the latest one was the Russia-Ukraine war, which continues as we speak. And we've talked about this in this commentary before. And China has certain views about that, and India has certain views about that. And of course, Canada and the United States are part of the NATO alliance that seems to be lining up against the Russians in that war and continues to get new members, with Sweden being the latest one to be entered into the NATO agreement. But increasingly, from a Western perspective, the choice is always, well, you should go with us, right? But that's not necessarily the way the rest of the world sees it. Bangladesh is a good example of that, because not only do they have the Chinese leaders influencing the government, they also have the Indian leaders influencing the government. And of course, they also have the heavy hand of the American government trying to influence the political leaders in Bangladesh. So it is interesting to look at it from afar, and I'm sure it's the same way when you look at it from South Africa or Brazil or some of these other countries that are joining in these other groups. Because as the world changes and as it fractures along different lines, both political and economic, these different countries are going to have to make some difficult choices. And Bangladesh is just one example of a country that's on the rise, but will certainly, in this current global political economy, has to make some choices. And I'll give that up to you, Dr. Haque, to continue.
Thank you, Phil. So you have brought up certain issues, and I think when I look into it, the difference that I see between, you have mentioned that India has influence on Bangladesh. You have mentioned China has influence on Bangladesh. But at the same time, Americans are also trying to influence in Bangladesh. The difference that I see is the way they influence each other. So while Americans, and including Europeans, are trying to ensure that the country has an election process that is transparent. And the reason they are doing it is very clear, because I think they're trying to push the government on one side. Because the government is not on their side, it's more influenced by India and China. And that is the position the government has taken. And the interesting part, which we not as a part of the government, but as an intellectual group, we look into it, the way Americans would like to influence the election. So they are talking about increasingly about democracy, transparency, but that's not the same case when you are dealing with Egypt, for example. So in other words, it selectively puts countries for that. And that itself is going to backfire to me, because when I look into this, the respect that we have developed over time, because we were part of the British Commonwealth for many, many years, and was that Western had certain strong values of democracy, but as the world becoming smaller and smaller, as we know from each other every day what happens in Canada, we also know in Bangladesh. So with this kind of world, I think it's becoming more difficult for countries, US, for example, to show that they are playing democracy as the end result. The end result is not democracy as such. The end result is to make sure the government is on their side. I think that is something many of us, I would say, are not very comfortable with. Although the process probably will help some people, in other words, opposition, they would like to see that. But at the same time, it is also true, and my belief is that opposition will also see exactly the same way once in the power. In other words, they will realize that the Western are not interested in the democracy as such, not interested in accountability as such, because they are selectively using this, I would say, phrase for different countries in the world. And that itself was never been so clear as we see things, happening in Bangladesh. Right now, as we speak, American, at least two high-level officials are in Dhaka. Europeans are sending their officials in Dhaka, ensuring that the election process is fair. But having said it, the election process was not always fair in the last 10 years or 15 years. And they were very quiet. They were very quiet. They didn't worry about it much. They did, but as I've said, like, they didn't say that the government has to change. But now they're putting some, I would say, explicit pressure on the government, which I, as a person, would not be very happy with, because I think that's exactly like the accusation that Trump, during the Democrats, have in America, that how Russians are influenced. My point is that this game of influence probably looks very simple, but it doesn't go very well in this part of the world. You look carefully. This has happened now in Africa, particularly with the French colonies, former French colonies. I didn't know that the former French colonies started paying taxes to the French government because of the protection or defense, something very unusual because we never knew it. But see, as the world is becoming smaller, this is now clearer that how the influence was there. And these are issues probably is troubling most of the people in the world. That the influence has nothing to do with the people of this country or the region. It is mostly driven by the interest of the West for their own benefit. And that is something I'm not very comfortable with. I think we should look into the world eye to eye equally and respect each other. Obviously, I also want democratic freedom. I also want transparency, but I want it to be fairly done. So that is how I would put it, the way I see.
You've also told me through the years that, take the government of Bangladesh, for example, they have to make decisions based on a whole host of things, but they also make decisions based on the obvious example of intelligence services being in the background, whether it's India, Pakistan, China, or the United States, whoever it is. And I also thought it was interesting, too, what you said regarding influence. You talked about Russian influence on the American elections last time, or possible influence. Also, believe it or not, in Canada, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's been a huge controversy about Chinese interference with our elections in the last two elections here in Canada, now to a point where there's a public inquiry having to do with Chinese influence on our elections. Now, you could imagine 35 years ago when you lived here in this neighborhood, you could probably never imagine something like that.
No.
That's how the world has changed, right? The world's become smaller, and of course, there's the advent of social media too, which has made quite a difference. And so, about how all these different countries try to influence each other, and of course, the stronger countries have more influence than some of the smaller countries in this regard.
Yes, I think that is what is happening. I think the point for interest for both of us when you look at East and West is to educate us and see that I think in order to earn respect from around the globe, and I always thought European has better values. They were less interfering than US. US being one of the top leader of the global economy, they used to influence everyone. That we were aware of. But I have seen most of the time Europe as being much more neutral position than the rest, and so we had different opinion on Europe. But increasingly, this is also Europe is also looks like they are also playing the same game as United States, which something is not very helpful because you need those neutral power, those neutral groups to for people to be neutral and to be say, look, this is a fair game. As I said, like when Egyptian government, democratic government was ousted by the army, there was not much thinking and nobody is talking about bringing democracy back there. At the same time, when you look into the democracy, even in, for example, in Iraq, this is US is not very comfortable with that democracy either. What I mean that they had Iranian influence coming back, something like this. So I think the game of democracy is a buzzword. It is something that is going to harm everyone. But I think the West, particularly my feeling is that Europeans should have played a more neutral role to define the world rather than being part of the baggage of the US. And we know Canada, for example, is very is a close neighbor of the United States. Your trade is linked to the United States. You cannot do much with it. So we know the signaling that we get. For example, I was talking to my colleagues today, and we said what Canada says in public, or United Kingdom says in public, or Australia says in public, is basically is a rehearsal that America, US will probably say tomorrow. So it's like a rehearsal, dress rehearsal done by these smaller three countries in the world. So we take the views of Canadian government, Australian government, and probably UK government, most likely. These are like a dress rehearsal group of United States superpower as a superpower group. Europe, we always thought is much more neutral. Something that is bugging me, something that is, giving me an idea that the world has completely changed. And I agree with you, the world has completely changed probably over the last 30 years.
Well, it has. And, you know, we haven't mentioned Japan. We haven't mentioned Brazil very much. But, you know, in terms of the change, you're right. I mean, it's incredible. 35 years ago, when we were together at the University of Guelph, we could hardly imagine talking about these things. But the world has changed. It's become a lot more interwoven. And because of that, and I gave Bangladesh as the example, China and India at play there for global dominance, and the Bangladeshi government reacting on those things. But yeah, seems like all these different countries have much more to think about than they used to.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. I think with that, we close to this month East-West, and we'll see you next month again with a new episode on a new global issues.
Thank you very much.